Let's see. I'm supposed to go to Instagram. Is this how it's supposed to even look? And why is there a delay? Let me go back to this. Well, I need to put this. Oh, good day. Yeah, we got two. We can start. We can start. Good day and gratitude. Oh, all of a sudden, honey, I feel hungry, but yeah. Mm. Oh, shit, wait a minute. Am I supposed to mute this on Instagram? I can tell you right now, I don't even like Instagram. Oh yeah. Well, the copyright disclaimer under 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use of use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. We're going to get right to reading tonight. Yeah, we're going to get right to reading. Malcolm X. I can't say how many chapters I'm going to read. We'll see. We will see, because we are on chapter 10, A Man Named Martin. And we know this is Martin Luther King. There's only one Martin. See? Let's see, how many chapters is it? I think we'll go to chapter 15. I could do it. Yeah. And then tomorrow night, we'll finish the book. Yeah. All right, let's do it. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. No one stands alone in history. Earl Little, Malcolm's father, lived during the era of Marcus Garvey. Garvey's ideas and leadership influenced the Little family. Before Garvey, there was Booker T. Washington and William E. B. Du Bois. Before all of these men, there was the fiery Frederick Douglass. And before Douglass, there were others, some free, some enslaved, who sought freedom and equality for their people, for us. Even when he was most active, creating a style and form of leadership that would inspire others, Malcolm was being compared to other Black leaders of this period. The most notable of these was Martin Luther King Jr. During the period of African enslavement, the owners understood very clearly that the Africans did not want to work in their fields or to be held in bondage. Afraid that they were making plans to rise up against them, plantation owners tried to keep the Blacks from gathering in groups when they were not supervised. Let me turn some air on because, menopause will, go there. Yeah, menopause do not play, but honey, I'm handling it well. Yes. Let's read. The only exceptions to this, and this was allowed only in some cases, were religious meetings. Few Africans had retained a major body of knowledge about African religions, and most adopted the Christianity that they had been introduced to in the South. The expression of their religious beliefs, let me turn it down just a little bit. The expression of their religious beliefs was important to African Americans, sometimes for families barely surviving on rural tenant farms or in urban tenements. It was the only way to release the emotions that filled them, emotions of sorrow, of joy, of reverence for a supreme being. In the Black community, the man of God, the man who could give voice to the yearnings and fears of his people, was highly respected. We've always had that communion with a higher power. We have. We've always been spiritual. I ain't gonna get off track. Yeah. Good day, Layla. So good to see you. You are so welcome. Gratitude to you for being here. Yep. I never read these books either. This is my first time reading any of these books. I didn't even know they existed. And I feel so, sad sometimes about that and stuff because I didn't know. It's my fault, and it's, I had some responsibility in that too. Everybody did, the schools, my pastor, everybody did and stuff, but I can forgive us for that because I'm learning now. I'm learning motherfucking now. I'm making sure we all learn now, if that's the case. So thank you, my sister. Thank you. Because it's worth it. My ancestors, they just want us to know them. They need us to know them right now. Right now. I wish I could read to us all the time and stuff, and I will when the ancestors say it's time. Then I'll be on here reading often and stuff. Might be different books every time because I read multiple books. But yeah, let's read. There were few other fields that afforded Blacks a leadership role. Some preachers like Earl Little had only a few followers and preached their sermons wherever they could, sometimes in churches that needed a minister for a short time, sometimes in small rooms borrowed for the purpose. Other preachers, usually those in large cities, managed either to buy or build large churches and preach to hundreds of people each week, every week. Successful preachers could often rally entire communities around their ministry, and by careful leadership, they could influence local governments to some extent. The communities, in turn, often looked toward men of daring and intelligence to be the heads of their churches. Malcolm began his ministry in the Islamic religion in the big cities of the North, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. While he was spreading the word of the Nation of Islam, there were other Black movements going on around the country, movements that would bring forth other leaders. Jim Crow laws, those laws that allowed cities and states to prevent blacks from enjoying the same privileges as white people, were prevalent throughout the South in the 50s. Blacks were forbidden to drink from the same fountains as whites, were not allowed to sit with whites in theaters, were not allowed to eat in restaurants reserved for whites only, or even to share public facilities with whites. One particular law said that blacks had to sit in the rear of buses. Some buses had special sections marked colored, while in others it was just understood that blacks sat in the rear, while whites sat in the front. The usual result of Jim Crow laws was that blacks had poorer facilities than whites, or none at all. In Montgomery, Alabama, the law said that blacks sat in the rear of the bus, moving toward the front as the rear of the bus filled. But if the white section of the bus filled, then blacks sitting near the front would have to get up and give their seats to any whites who boarded the bus, standing if there was no other seats available. On the first day of December 1955, a smallish black woman sat down near the center of a nearly empty bus in Montgomery. Rosa Parks had just come home from work and was on her way home. She was told by the driver to get up and move to the rear of the bus to allow a white man to sit in her seat. She had paid the same fare, the same amount of money as the white rider, and refused to give up her seat. It was against the law in Montgomery for a black person to refuse to give up a seat when told to do so, and Rosa Parks was arrested. The Supreme Court had already ruled the year before in the Brown decision that school segregation was unconstitutional. The court had ruled that when black children went to segregated schools, they were hurt because segregation itself injured them. Lawyers thought that other cases involving segregation would have to be tried before all segregation was officially ended. When the black community of Montgomery discovered that Rosa Parks had been arrested, it decided to fight the case both in the streets and in the courts. The black leadership in Montgomery understood that the case could be an important one with a lot of press coverage, and they needed a leader who could handle both the planned boycott of the buses and the press. The black leadership. After much discussion, they decided on a young minister who had recently moved to Montgomery from Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on the 15th of January, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His grandfather on his mother's side, Adam Daniel Williams, had founded the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta in 1894. Martin's father had taken over the church in 1931. And it was under his leadership that the church became one of the most important black churches in Georgia. Martin Luther King Sr. fought for the rights of black people in Atlanta, and he was a leading member of the NAACP. Young Martin was a good student, skipping several grades in high school and entering Morehouse College in Atlanta at the age of 15. In 1948, he received a bachelor's degree from Morehouse and went on to Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. Oh yeah, that's the church that you go to become a pastor, a reverend. I knew it was something like that. Theological. Let me just make a little mark beside it. Theological. I couldn't think of what it was though. But here it is in this book. That ain't it. I guess it's a lot of them. It's more than one, I guess. The idea of the boycott was simple. The public transportation system in Montgomery depended on the fares of all its riders, blacks and whites. Without the blacks of Montgomery riding the buses and paying their fares, the bus company would lose money on a daily basis. The Montgomery boycott had another advantage that few black protests had had in the past: television. Instead of the struggle between blacks and whites being isolated within a community, the protesters were seen throughout the nation and eventually throughout the world. Martin Luther King Jr. was seen on television carefully, but with great passion, explaining the position of the boycotters. His nonviolent approach helped to bring sympathy to the movement, and he emerged from the successful boycott as the most famous black man in the United States of America. Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence had two major effects. The first was to create enormous sympathy for the Black cause throughout the world. The second was to increase moral pressure on American legislators to pass and enforce the new civil rights law. I digress. While Dr. King's tactics were nonviolent, the resistance against the growing civil rights movement was far from nonviolent. Civil rights workers were frequently attacked. Sometimes the attacks were mild, sometimes they were extremely violent. Dr. King himself was put into jail and his home was bombed. Black students who sat in at lunch counters reserved for whites only under the Jim Crow laws were humiliated, and they had food and condiments thrown on their clothing and their heads. We seen some of the videos, they were spit on and kicked and pushed and just being yelled at. Yeah. Racist mobs ridiculed the nonviolent protesters. School children who attempted to enroll at previously all-white schools were being barred at the school doors or harassed to the point that they did not wish to risk being hurt by attending the schools. Dr. King vowed to carry on the nonviolent crusades against the evils of second-class citizenship throughout the South. In May 1957, when New Yorkers were talking about the strength of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, people in the South were talking about the strength of Martin Luther King Jr. and nonviolence. Two men, one in the South, the other in the North. Both of them represented areas of Black experience. Let me show you these pictures before I forget. Look at Betty. Beautiful. This is one of the signs that was on the buses. That's how it looked. Oh, honey, you better stop scratching on my little footstool. Yeah, no smoking. White passengers seat from front, colored passengers from the rear. And this picture right here, nonviolent acts of civil disobedience characterized by the civil rights movement under Dr. King. If you can see that right there. It don't have many pictures in it, but we'll show them and stuff. Martin Luther King Jr., with roots deeply planted in Georgia soil, represented a more traditional approach. His was the leadership of Christianity and nonviolence. Malcolm, whose father and grandfather had come from Georgia as well, also represented the Black experience. Blacks before Malcolm, men such as Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Gabriel Prosser, Prosser, had resorted to violence or the threat of violence to obtain their rights. Both men were involved with their respective religions. Dr. King's advocacy of nonviolence was in the tradition of idealistic Christianity and the teachings of Gandhi, the Indian leader. Martin Luther King Jr. marshaled not only the members of his own church, but members of other Christian churches as well. Malcolm X could direct not only his own temple under the guidance of Elijah Muhammad, but temples throughout the country. Many strategists believe that Dr. King's philosophy was particularly suited to the South, where the oppression of Black people was worse and the possibility of retaliatory violence was much greater. Even the threat of Black on white violence would have greatly increased the amount of people injured and killed. Dr. King also realized that the Jim Crow laws were beginning to be an embarrassment to the American government. Americans were having trouble calling themselves the world's greatest democracy when they allowed the public humiliation of American citizens just because of their color. But the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X took a different view of American history. The United States had been created as a democracy that aspired to freedom while slavery existed within its borders. This is Malcolm X right here leading a rally. And that's leading a rally right there. It don't say where it's at. But that pharmacy says Lennox Pharmacy. There's a lot of Lennox pharmacies and stuff. Look at our people. Just beautiful. My brother. The differences between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were primarily in their methods. Both men were dedicated to bettering the condition of their people. but there were major differences in how they were perceived by the outside world. Dr. King seemed, at least to liberal whites, to be a reasonable man, a man who had a higher moral purpose than most and whose cause was just. Nonviolence pointed up blacks as people who only wanted to exercise their rights as Americans. Day in and day out, the television news showed students and black protesters being beaten down, assaulted with fire hoses, just being whipped. Under Dr. King, blacks sat in and prayed in and asked the courts to assume their cases. To Malcolm, there was no need to change the moral plane of the movement or to seek white sympathizers. If African Americans did not have the same rights as whites, he reasoned, it was only because whites did not want to grant those rights. He said, we are humbling ourselves, sitting in and begging, trying to unite with the slave master. Look at this picture right here of them hoses. And I forgot how much them hoses were. They 70 pounds of pressure, 120 pounds of pressure. It was enough pressure from them hoses that it'll flay your skin off of you. Yep. In Birmingham, Alabama, police used water cannons against civil rights demonstrators. And that right there, I might as well show you this one right here too. That's Martin and Malcolm. At just one, they had more than one meeting. The white man is telling you, you can't live here. You can't enter here. You can't eat here, drink here, walk here. You can't ride here. You can't play here. You can't study here. Haven't we yet seen enough to see that he had no plan to unite with you? For all of his public life, Malcolm was compared to Martin Luther King Jr. It was a comparison that Malcolm accepted, for it pointed out the differences between the Nation of Islam and the traditional black protest movement that King represented. Dr. King urged blacks to maintain their own humanity in the face of white oppression, to love whites as brothers, despite discrimination and violence. Malcolm said it was ridiculous for black men to turn the other cheek when their women and children were being beaten and killed. Hostility was the only language, he said, that some people understood. Malcolm knew that he was considered the bad man of the black movement and that King was considered to be the good one. He relished his bad image. Yes, honey. Red did. Yeah, Malcolm relished his bad image. So did for black people. I'm going to show you this right here too, this picture over here. Oh, that's the FBI's file on Malcolm X. We just going to give it a glance because it's really tiny, but we can make some now. What both men had in common with each other, with Malcolm's father, with Marcus Garvey, and with other African Americans in the long struggle for civil rights since the early 1920s, was scrutiny by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI understood that both men were effective leaders and wondered just where they would take the black movement. Well, see, here it is right here. Yeah, I never knew any of this. Okay, it says Detroit, Boston, May the 4th, 1953. Oh, this is the address. Subject resides at 4336 William Street, Inkster, Michigan. Subject claimed in June 1950 that he was a communist, and during September 1952, he indicated membership in the Muslim cult of Islam. This investigation was predicated upon information received from, they scratched out the snitch name. The subject was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, and is a citizen by virtue of his birth. You want to take a picture of that? The love. Nobody ever loved us this much, y'all. Chapter 11. Oh, my ancestors. The March on Washington. Let me get a good drink of water. Honey, September 1960, Malcolm was by now well known. Young black men quoted him on street corners. But how important a leader was Malcolm. African Americans in the inner cities were watching him, wondering what he would do next, where he would lead the movement. There were others watching him as well. The FBI had started a file on Malcolm. Paid black informants reported his most private conversations. But while Malcolm was considered in the United States to be a leader of some blacks and some vague organization known as the Nation of Islam, he was also being seen by some as a revolutionary. One of those who saw Malcolm as both a revolutionary and a possible ally in the United States was Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader. Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader. Fidel Castro was born in Oriente Province, Cuba, on the 13th of August, 1926. He was born in a Cuba that for years had been under the influence of the United States and which had oppressed the poor of that nation. Castro, after a long and difficult campaign, overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Castro, after a long and difficult campaign, overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The United States had supported Castro's struggle against the Batista dictatorship until, when he came to power, he declared himself a communist. Castro was an able leader and an aspiring speaker. After taking over the government of Cuba, he took over the American sugar business in his country and aligned himself with the worldwide communist movement. In September 1960, he came to the United States to address the United Nations. A Cuban who had fled Batista talked about his feelings for Fidel Castro. He is a wonderful man. When he speaks, his strength is in his words, his mouth. He speaks for the little people of Cuba. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had already been keeping tabs on Malcolm by paying informants within the Nation of Islam. Their attention was not on Malcolm, however, when Castro came to the United States. Castro, in violently taking over the government of Cuba, well, you know what Malcolm said, had made enemies, and the government did not want anything to happen to him in the United States. Secure hotels were suggested to his party, but they were rejected. Where would he stay? When Fidel Castro announced that he would stay in Harlem, in the Hotel Teresa, there was an uproar. Security arrangements had to be switched from Midtown, where Castro had been expected to stay, to the Harlem location. In Harlem, there was an air of excitement. Presidents had whizzed through Harlem, waving from fast-moving cars. And other government officials had made brief visits to Harlem, but no world leader had deliberately chosen the black community as his headquarters. The Hotel Teresa had been the gathering place and temporary residence of the most famous Harlemites. Joe Louis had stayed there, as had Nat King Cole and Sugar Ray Robinson. The bottom floors of the hotel housed a bar and a beauty salon. There were single rooms with no view and suites with balconies that overlooked the vibrant Harlem community. Y'all, I can see it now. It was so colorful. The newspapers had announced that Castro and his entourage would stay in the Teresa, and the streets around the hotel were jam-packed with African Americans, searching the balconies for a glimpse of the Cuban leader. The police department at first tried to keep the streets clear, but soon they gave up as the milling crowd grew from hundreds to thousands of black people. You will recognize him by his uniform. That was the rumor. Everybody was saying it because everybody was looking up, trying to see where is he. According to radio reports, Premier Castro still wore the uniform he wore in the jungles outside of Havana, where he fought with his brother and Che Guevara against Batista's army. Another rumor started circulating that the Cubans had brought live chickens into the hotel from La Maqueta, the Spanish-American market under the tracks in Spanish Harlem. Some thought that this rumor was just being spread to discredit the revolutionary leader. Malcolm and a few members of the Nation of Islam were also in the hotel. He sent a representative to the Cuban representatives. Fidel Castro in Cuba had heard of Malcolm. The American press had made sure that. Would he speak to the head of Temple Number 7? The answer was a resounding yes. The FBI by this time had informants who stayed close to Malcolm, agreeing with his statements and trying to stay within his good graces so they could report back to the Bureau. Motherfucking backstabbers. When Malcolm went to visit Premier Castro, however, the informant was not present at the meeting and had to discuss what had happened with Malcolm later. On the 21st of September, the informant told the FBI that Malcolm had told Premier Castro that when he saw a man that the United States was against, then he knew that there was probably something good about that man. The Cuban premier had replied that the people of the United States was not against him, only the government. The Beirut document went on to discuss Malcolm's reasons for visiting Premier Castro, which was that he was on a committee that had been formed to meet and greet delegates to the United Nations who came to Harlem. The Nation of Islam, Malcolm said, was basically a religious organization which could not form a partnership with a communist nation that did not accept the existence of a God. And this is a picture of them together, right there. Yeah. But the important aspect of Malcolm's meeting with Castro was the fact that it happened at all. The Bureau had already identified Castro as an important enemy of the United States. Cuba was only minutes by air from the Florida coast, and Castro was inviting Russian technicians into the small country. Although the FBI informant reported that the meeting between Castro and Malcolm had not been pre-planned, it was obvious that it had been. Castro had moved to the Hotel Teresa to make a point that he was sympathetic to the cause of Black people in the United States. And aliens between dissatisfied African Americans and a communist country that had a large Black population was viewed as a threat to the national security, especially by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By March 1961, special agents of the FBI were attending all of Malcolm's speeches. Malcolm knew that there were informants within the Nation of Islam and claimed that some of them had admitted as much to him. Had the motherfucking nerve to tell him. Goddamn takers. The possibility of anyone admitting to Malcolm that he was an FBI informant was highly unlikely. I finna say, I don't know. Somebody hurt our brother and took him away from us. Well, we know somebody was paid off to shoot him and stuff. But Dick Gregory said them bullets came from the roof, from up on top of the stage. I guess it was a balcony up there or something. I just learned it myself. It's a lot to it. It's very complex. But we still got to make sure we be okay through all of this and stuff. Yep. Got to be loyal. We got to be loyal to our ancestors. But Malcolm began to refer to the agents, whom he suspected to be Black, in his speeches. Later on a Washington, D.C. television program, he said, the FBI spends 24 hours a day infiltrating or trying to infiltrate Muslims. And after we hold our religious services, they go from door to door and ask questions of persons who come to the meetings to try to harass and frighten them. During 1962 and the early 1963, the FBI continued to watch Malcolm, attending all of his public appearances and paying special attention to the friction between Malcolm and the sons of Elijah Muhammad. The health of Elijah Muhammad was becoming more and more precarious. People close to him in the Nation of Islam did not expect him to be able to continue as the head of the Muslim organization for very long. Muhammad wanted his sons to take over the nation, but realized that Malcolm would be a strong contender for the leadership. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was in crisis. In Birmingham, Alabama, the public safety commissioner was Eugene Bull Connor. Bull Connor was determined to stop any pro-civil rights action by blacks in his city. When blacks attempted to demonstrate, he had hundreds, including students and children, hauled off to local jails. In addition, he used police dogs and fire hose to disperse crowds of young black people. President John F. Kennedy privately said that the brutality that Bull Connor displayed would do more to promote support for civil rights than anything he, as president, could have done. The violence against blacks in Birmingham continued, and the mood in Birmingham was getting uglier and uglier. Finally, though, the blacks had had enough and began to confront the Birmingham police. President Kennedy saw a possibly disastrous situation. He directed the troops move into Birmingham to keep the peace. All over the world, there were reports on what was happening in the United States, honey. The communist countries were playing and replaying scenes from the confrontations in Birmingham. When President Kennedy sent the routine message to the Conference of Independent African Nations that merely agreed with the stated aims of the conference, namely African unity, Prime Minister Milton Obote, O-B-O-T-E, sent back a scathing reply that condemned racism in Birmingham. President Kennedy did not want to have demonstrations and confrontations across the United States. He decided to sponsor civil rights legislation, which was quickly opposed by Southern congressmen. The anger that Black America was feeling in 1963, oh, honey, it was at a boiling point. The Kennedy administration wondered just where it would go. The Southerners who wanted to go slow on integration, who wanted to ease their way into change, had time-tested methods of preventing laws from being passed. They could simply prevent votes from ever taking place by not ending the debates on issues. Then, either the government would come to a complete halt, or whatever bill they wanted to prevent from passing would be put aside or in the trash. It was then that blacks began to talk about a march on the nation's capital. There had been other marches on Washington. After the First World War, there had been a march of veterans that filled the streets of the capital. Other groups had protested, mostly peacefully. But a black march on Washington, especially an angry march that threatened to be violent, was surely not something the government wanted. The Kennedy administration called in black leaders and black thinkers, the critical thinkers, and asked for advice. The advice was that Black America was motherfucking angry and something needed to be done and done quickly. It was clear that Martin Luther King Jr.'s policy of nonviolence was not what angry blacks around the country was interested in hearing. The Nation of Islam is often called the Black Muslims, and although they preached non-aggression, it was always felt among blacks and whites that the threat of violence lay just beneath the surface of their actions. If Martin Luther King Jr. could get thousands of blacks to pray and protest peacefully, it was feared that Malcolm might get them to tear America apart. Oh, honey. Yeah. Ooh. President Kennedy first tried to stop the march, but then once he saw that blacks were actually organizing it, encouraged the march under the nonviolent leadership supported by the administration. Malcolm was furious. First, he was furious that the traditional black leadership had helped the administration change a march of angry and determined people into what he called a farce on Washington. Then he was angry that the black leaders had accepted whites as leaders of the march. As the march took shape, it seemed that Malcolm was right in his predictions. Members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, who had been active in the sit-ins throughout the South, had prepared a speech. But the speech was viewed by some white clergymen as being too hostile, and it was changed. The signs that marchers were allowed to carry were cleared through a committee that made sure they weren't offensive. Every detail of the march was planned, much of it by white people. When Malcolm, who went to Washington as an observer, heard about the arguments between the black students who wanted to take a more militant stance and the whites who were participating in the march, He repeated his charge, made before he went to Washington, that whites were using blacks as puppets. Honey, look at the March on Washington. White folks infiltrated it. That's why our brother got his channel, the Angry Black Men Book Club. Reading too. Sure wills. And he's very knowledgeable. Look here, you can see some of, yeah, you see him on the side right there. In the white right there. Recording everything, looking at everything, holding everything. There go a few throughout the crowd and stuff, yeah. Finally, the day of the march came. The 28th of August, 1963, was a glorious, bright, and sunny day for the largest civil rights demonstration the United States had ever seen. Over 250,000 people from all over the country, y'all, they traveled to Washington, D.C. There were whites and blacks, rich and poor, trade union members, politicians, athletes, ministers, people from all walks of life, many of whom had never participated in any civil rights demonstration ever before. To some, the March on Washington turned out to be a well-orchestrated and enormous outpouring of support for civil rights. To others, it turned out to be simply a grand picnic, an overblown feel-good session rescued only by the stern speech of Martin Luther King Jr. His "I Have a Dream" speech, made on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, turned the day into a memorable experience. One of King's advisors, Stanley Levison, said, "It was marvelous in Martin's speech. It was marvelous in Martin's speech the way he handled the white and Negro question, completely repudiating this kind of nonsense of atom power and the Muslims." And that's Adam Clayton Powell Jr. right there. I don't know why I used to think he was married to Lucy Parsons. I got her book over there. I was thinking he was married to her, but I have to find out. But let's read. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a black congressman from Harlem who, like Malcolm, did not believe that demonstrations of support, such as the March on Washington, would bring about real change. Less than 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, the 15th of September, Sunday school was being held at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. In the women's class, the topic was "The Love That Forgives." Oh, this the babies. I never knew. Let me underline that date. The 4 babies that were in the bombing. It was in Birmingham, Alabama. Suddenly there was a tremendous noise and the entire building was shaken. Adult men were tossed about, chairs overturned. There were violent screams of agony and softer moans. Women ignored their own pain as they searched through the rubble for their children. People were being put into cars and taken to hospitals. The wail of ambulances cut through the morning air. 4 black children were killed in the bombing. In another part of the city, a 13-year-old black boy was shot to death by a young white boy returning home from a segregationist meeting. King's supporters were angry. They told him that he could not preach nonviolence in the face of the deaths of black children and not have some positive plan, some actions that blacks could take to move forward. King was deeply hurt by the bombings. He trusted y'all. Still, he adhered to his policy of nonviolence and began making plans for a massive voting campaign. The violence against blacks was overwhelming and seemingly growing. Increasingly, it was Malcolm's voice that African Americans were hearing as the voice of reason. How could you turn the other cheek when your children were being killed? Chapter 12. Honey, we made it to chapter 12. Sure did. Chapter 12, the split with Elijah Muhammad. Within the Nation of Islam, the split between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was becoming more pronounced, more difficult to handle. Muhammad was still limiting his statements to the core philosophy of the Nation of Islam, while Malcolm was talking about international issues. Increasingly, when some incident occurred either in the United States or abroad, the media was turning to Malcolm for a response. Elijah Muhammad was more than willing to allow the more widely read Malcolm to speak for the Nation of Islam. It was Malcolm, not Muhammad, who could challenge even the most experienced debaters on television or on college campuses. And it was Malcolm who seemed to have his finger on the pulse of what was happening in the country and abroad. It was Malcolm who had challenged the organization of the March on Washington, and Malcolm who had responded most forcefully to the Birmingham bombings. Muhammad was often put in a position of being asked if he agreed with Malcolm. Muhammad realized that Malcolm was a dynamic speaker, and he was a younger man with enormous energy. Betty X saw her husband always on the go, always traveling to teach or to act as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Malcolm often felt that he did not spend enough time with his family, although the time he did spend with his young wife and daughters were times of great warmth and tenderness. But Betty knew how important his work was too. They would go to the beach, and she would find herself playing with the children as Malcolm worked over a speech or considered a strategy for an upcoming meeting. The children knew little of their father's work, and they were surprised to see news clips of him on television when he was home. Malcolm, since his release from prison, had dedicated his life to the Nation of Islam. He had brought the nation from a relatively small, loosely organized group to one of the most powerful political forces in America. It was not simply the membership that made it a potent group, but the composition of that membership, the large body of highly disciplined and openly militant Black men and women, ready to respond at a moment's notice to any emergency and under the leadership of a fiery leader, was something that the United States had not seen before. The Nation of Islam claimed not to encourage violence, but people listening to Malcolm weren't sure, especially when he pointed out to Black men that they had not been nonviolent in the wars that America had fought overseas. Why? He challenged. Are you going to be nonviolent when they bomb your churches and kill your children? The United States was waiting for an answer. But Malcolm had also grown over the years he had been with the nation. He felt that he could lead the nations into a more active role than the one selected by Elijah Muhammad. He still claimed to believe in the basic philosophy of Elijah Muhammad, but had his own ideas as well. In fact, he had not grown beyond the Nation of Islam so much as in a different direction. There were constant rumors about and around the Nation of Islam. Some of the sources of the rumors were clear, others were not. But one of the rumors had been circulating in the early summer of 1963 was that Elijah Muhammad was the father of several children by women to whom he was not married. This was a violation on the principles of the Muslims. In July 1963, the Los Angeles papers had reported that the 67-year-old Muhammad was facing 2 paternity suits. Malcolm also was having problems with the internal run-ins of the nation. He recognized that the Muslims were asking for financial support from people who could scarcely pay their rent. There was talk of people being intimidated. That's Malcolm and Elijah. Many of the problems indirectly were Malcolm's fault. He had expanded the nation faster than the nation could expand its leadership capabilities. Elijah Muhammad had made him a national minister, but was refusing to give him the full authority to reorganize the nation. Instead, Malcolm was asked several times to tone down his remarks. Muhammad realized that the scrutiny the nation was getting in the press needed careful handling, and that Malcolm's style was anything but careful. Ooh. When Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was assassinated in the summer of 1963, it was all the Nation of Islam could do to keep Malcolm calm. Malcolm was further enraged when the little girls were killed in Birmingham. Malcolm wrote to Elijah Muhammad and asked to talk to him about the infidelities that were charged. Elijah Muhammad invited Malcolm to the Arizona home where he had gone to live because of his health, because they said he wasn't in the best of health and stuff. When Malcolm arrived at Elijah's home in Phoenix, the two men embraced, as they always had. "Well, son," Muhammad said, "what is on your mind?" Malcolm told Elijah Muhammad what was being said about him, and that he, Malcolm, wanted to teach that a man's accomplishments were more important than his weaknesses. Elijah seemed to agree with Malcolm. Malcolm was clearly disappointed in the man who had been his advisor and mentor, and of whom he had once said, "He was the messenger of Allah. When I was a foul, vicious convict, so evil that other convicts called me Satan, this man has rescued me. He was the man who had trained me, who had treated me as if I were his own flesh and blood. He was the man who had given me wings to go places, to do things I otherwise never would have dreamed of. We walked with me caught in a whirlwind of emotions." And that's in the autobiography of Malcolm X. Malcolm was disappointed, but so was Elijah Muhammad, who saw Malcolm as turning against him. Instead of doing the right thing. Malcolm returned to New York and continued to speak both to the Nation of Islam meetings and to answer questions about the civil rights movement. At this time, the country was getting more involved in the Vietnam War, and Malcolm made several statements about the possible involvement of the United States in the assassination of two Vietnamese officials. Black leaders in the NAACP and the SNCC were trying to head off more violence and confrontations, including King's nonviolent confrontation, until they came up with a new strategy. President Kennedy was trying to appeal to Southern politicians behind the scenes. His advisors doubted the wisdom of his traveling to Dallas, but he decided to make the trip. Friday, the 22nd of November, 1963, the presidential motorcade had made its way slowly through the Dallas streets. In the open car, President Kennedy sat next to his wife, Jackie. John Connally, governor of Texas, sat in front of him. Suddenly, there was a series of shots. A Secret Service agent ran around the back of the car. Kennedy's head jerked back. Jackie Kennedy reacted physically, moving almost out of the car. The President of the United States had been assassinated. It was a bitterly cold day in New York when the news came that the president had been murdered. The first thing that blacks wanted to know was if a black man had been accused of killing him. When it was discovered that Lee Harvey Oswald, a white man, had been accused, there was a collective sigh of relief, followed by a feeling of sincere grief. John F. Kennedy had been the most popular president among blacks since Franklin Roosevelt. The ministers of the Nation of Islam received instructions not to comment on the assassination. Elijah Muhammad had made a speaking engagement on Monday, the 1st of December, which he canceled. Malcolm was told to speak in his place. When he had finished speaking, he was immediately questioned about the assassination of the president. Malcolm said that the president had allowed the assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother. He said that the president never foresaw that the chickens would come home to roost so soon. Malcolm claimed later that he felt that the atmosphere of violence in the United States had been tolerated by the administration, and that it was this atmosphere that had finally claimed the life of the president. But the statement was interpreted by the press. And a grieving nation as showing pleasure over the death of Kennedy. Black people too. Didn't even hear what Malcolm had to say. Malcolm was officially silenced by Elijah Muhammad. The press was notified that Malcolm would not be allowed to speak for 90 days. Malcolm accepted the discipline. He felt hurt and betrayed. "I felt as though something in nature had failed," he said, "like the sun or the stars." Malcolm had met a young boxer, Cassius Clay. 2 years earlier, he had seen him at a number of Muslim meetings. He knew him to be interested in the Nation of Islam. Clay invited Malcolm and his family to his fight camp in Miami. Clay was the underdog in a match against the then heavyweight champion of the world, Sonny Liston. Liston, a huge man, seemed invincible. Clay didn't look nearly as menacing as the older boxer. The former Olympic champion was young, brash, and handsome. While Clay trained for the fight, Malcolm struggled with his strained relations with the Nation of Islam. The night of the fight, the 25th of February 1964, Malcolm sat in seat number 7 for the preliminary fights. Before the fight started, he went to Clay's dressing room and joined him for a moment of silent prayer. The actual fight started as expected, with the doleful Liston stopping the younger Clay. Between the 4th and 5th rounds, it looked as if the fight might be stopped, as Clay claimed that he had got something in his eyes and couldn't see. But Clay did continue and scored a 7th round knockout that stunned the sports world. After the fight, Clay went to Malcolm's motel, and there was a party during which Clay ate ice cream and joked with his supporters. I can see him now. Can't you see Muhammad Ali joking and stuff? Malcolm photographed the young champion. At the press conference the next day, Clay made a confession of faith in the religion of Islam. He would later change his name to Muhammad Ali. There was a frenzy of excitement. Now there were 2 black men, both young, articulate, and attractive, both national figures who had adopted the religion of Islam. As expected, there were negative reactions. People who prided themselves on being tolerant of our religions attacked Clay. Malcolm returned to New York, where he heard more negative stories about himself and his betrayal of Elijah Muhammad. He wondered what he should do. Death threats were received from sources that could not be ignored. He was working on a book with Alex Haley, the black writer who had interviewed him for Playboy magazine. Haley noted that Malcolm looked tired. Malcolm was more than tired. He was physically and mentally drained. But even though he was extremely exhausted, he understood what the rumors meant, that the Nation of Islam was finished with him. He decided that the only logical course of action for him was to make the break as cleanly as possible. On the 8th of March, 1964, he announced his split from the Nation of Islam. You just got to cut it. Just cut your losses. It's been good. And that's him when he did it right there. Look at that smile. Look at his smile right there. He had grown. Yep, that was an opportunity. That was our opportunity when Malcolm wanted to reorganize the Nation of Islam. I'm convinced that more of us would be possibly in with the Nation of Islam. You know, it was a possibility. With Malcolm's fire and protection and inspiration and motivation and his guidance, his visions and ideas, we would have. That's a beautiful background. Look. Look at that background right there. Ain't that beautiful? There was a flurry of FBI memos from New York to Washington as the New York Times reported the story on the front page. Other papers across the nation did the same. On the 12th of March, Malcolm announced the formation of an organization called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. I never heard of it before, ever. For all the love. Chapter 13. Honey, we making way. Thank you, ancestors. I thank you so much. Gratitude to you for your patience and your presence, because I know I'm long-winded. You ain't got to stay long as I get started and stuff. That's perfect. Y'all know what I'm reading and stuff. And, you can come back because, I ain't going to finish it tonight. And yeah, this is all just learning. We can't take it all in at once. We got to take small bites. How you eat the pink elephant in the room, a bite at a time. You get it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, good day, young Dee. It's so good to see you. Good day, Hank. How you doing? Good day. Okay, I don't know why my thing. 1968. Kindly 1968. Good day, 1968. Uncle Cal, it's so good to see you. It is always so good to see y'all. I be so happy when I see y'all too. My family. I love y'all. I love us to life. I do. Yeah, it ain't nothing like us. It ain't. Yes. It ain't nothing like us. Ooh, chapter 13. Malcolm's Hodge. Malcolm was disappointed about his separation from the Nation of Islam, but he was prepared to move on. The Muslim Mosque Incorporated was to be a political organization dedicated to helping African Americans. But a good part of what had made Malcolm leave the Nation of Islam was the worsening morale climate he sensed within the organization. At the time, he understood from the way that information was being leaked to the white press and by the way that even private conversations seemed to find their way into the public sector, that the Nation of Islam had been infiltrated by some police agency. There was no way for him to know how much of the information he had received about Elijah Muhammad was being generated by infiltrators. He did know that he wanted his own organization to have an absolutely clean record. Malcolm decided that a leader who preached morality and preached a religious way of life should start with himself as an example. Malcolm, while he was with the Nation of Islam, had accumulated almost nothing in the way of financial gain. The profits from the newspaper he created, Muhammad Speaks, which was being sold throughout the country, went to the Nation of Islam. Even the royalties from the book he agreed to publish with Doubleday were signed over to the Nation of Islam, and their ass took it. They took it. And made Betty be at their mercy while Malcolm was out doing the ancestors' work, doing the highest work. I forgive everybody, but I side with Malcolm. I side my ass with Malcolm X. Sure do. And we still gonna save our people together. For Malcolm to start the next phase of his life, he had to go to Boston and talk to his sister Ella. Remember, he went and lived with Ella. Ella, he said, I want to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. 1/6 of all the people of the world follow the religion of Islam. 1/6 of all the people of the world. It is the youngest of the three religions most widely followed in the West: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. While it is not widely known in the United States, Islam is the dominant religion of Africa and Asia. The basic belief of Muslims, those that follow Islam, can be summed up in one sentence. There is no God but God, Allah. There is no God, little g, but God, big G. Then it's got Allah in parentheses. Arm, leg, and head. Arm, leg, arm, head. Yeah. Arm, leg, arm, head. And Muhammad is the prophet of God. There are 5 demands on those who follow the Islamic faith. They must confess that they are believers in Islam. They must worship through their 5 daily prayers. They must fast for the month of Ramadan. They must make a pilgrimage or a Hajj to Mecca. And they must demonstrate their generosity to the poor. For Malcolm, the Hajj was both a symbol of religious devotion and of his break from the Nation of Islam. Most Nation of Islam members did not and would never be able to make the trip to Mecca. To begin with, the expense of the trip to Mecca in Saudi Arabia was too much for most members. Oh, Ella must have had some money. She sent him there. Yep, to send him there. Second, to enter the Islamic holy city, one had to receive permission from Islamic officials. The Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims, as they were called, were often not considered true Muslims by the international Islamic communities. And even if she didn't have money and stuff like that, she made it happen. Ella did. He knew who to go to. Yep. Malcolm applied for a visa and was told that no Muslim who had converted to Islam in America could get a passport to the holy city without a letter of approval from Dr. Muhammad Yusuf Shawarbi. Muhammad Yusuf Shawarbi, the director of the Federation of Islamic Associations in the United States. Malcolm had met Dr. Shawarbi previously, and it was with confidence that he called him. Dr. Shawarbi was glad to hear from Malcolm, and the needed letter of approval was quickly given. He also gave him a book, The Eternal Message of Muhammad, by Abd al-Rahman Azam, a Saudi scholar and an advisor of King Faisal, Faisal, the ruler of Saudi Arabia. He also gave Malcolm the telephone number of the author's son who lived in Jeddah, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and that of his own son. On April 13, 1964, Malcolm's wife and 3 daughters accompanied him on the trip from his East Elmhurst home to nearby Kennedy Airport. The first stop of his flight was in Frankfurt, Germany, where Malcolm took a brief tour of the city before catching his next flight to Cairo. In his autobiography, he states that he was struck by the friendliness of the German people he met in Frankfurt. It was obvious that Malcolm, even before the trip, had made some very sweeping decisions about the philosophy of the Nation of Islam. He was soon referring to the Muslims as a separatist organization. In speeches he would make shortly after he returned from his trip, he would announce that he was no longer restricted by Muslims. Although he expressed a great deal of hurt in his split from Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, it was clear that he was ready to move on. The break between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was one that could have been predicted years before, and which Muhammad surely anticipated. Elijah Muhammad was basically a conservative man with a radical idea: the self-development of African Americans apart from white Americans. But if that was the goal, and Malcolm was making it happen, it said that he was okay with Malcolm receiving the fame. People went to Malcolm. So Malcolm was an enormously gifted man, a thinker. Oh, wait a minute, let me back up. He was willing to patiently create a movement that would slowly grow and which would affect limited numbers of people for the time being. Malcolm was an enormously gifted man, a thinker, a man to whom the idea of revolution was not only possible, but necessary. He believed, as the writer Tony K. Bambara stated, that the ultimate goal of a Black leader was to make revolution irresistible. Muhammad understood young men. He could sense Malcolm's impatience and his need for guidance and reassurance in his early days with the Nation of Islam. Muhammad also saw that Malcolm was not a man whose ideas and ambitions would be held in check forever. Malcolm's effect on the press was also understood. He was a dynamic speaker. His appearance, his 6'3" height, his boyish smile, his quiet theatrics kept the cameras rolling. Muhammad saw all of this. He saw the lure of the spotlight and realized its dangers. But Malcolm had been expanding the Nation of Islam at a great rate. Muhammad hoped that he could contain the younger, more gifted man. Malcolm's sense of self was both effective and to many annoying. How they couldn't handle it. Nope, they needed him to dim his light, dim himself. Look at him in Egypt. They knew they needed Malcolm to dim his light and his love for his people. And right today, that light and that love for us is Malcolm's. Right today, it still is Malcolm's. The Nation of Islam, they still do have some influence with us. And they possibly could still be one of those that'll go out there. Because I see them all the time when I go over north and stuff. And I'm at the right time and stuff. And they out approaching our people and stuff. They still do that. Go out and reach out to our people and stuff. But the reformation needed to happen. I'm just saying, in my opinion, little bitty old me, uneducated me, for my people, it needed to happen. Because this, what did happen, it didn't help much. The little bit that it did help, it's slow. It's too slow. We would have been further more prepared, more mentally ready and able and willing. Malcolm's sense of self was both effective and to many annoying. Some saw his comments on what he was doing as manipulative and mocking. Others saw them as demonstrations of his openness. But his self-awareness, the keen sense of who he was as a black man, allowed Malcolm to grow at an enormous rate. When he broke from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm knew he needed even more growth. He needed to see more, to talk more with people with a wider world view, and without the restrictions that the philosophy of the Nation of Islam placed upon him. He needed, he said, to start thinking for himself. In truth, he had always thought for himself, but had tried to fit his thinking into the concept of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. What neither man knew, though, was the extent to which they were both being watched by local police and the FBI. Malcolm suspected that many of his conversations were being reported to the government organizations. FBI reports detailed private conversations between Elijah Muhammad and his staff about the fact that Malcolm had left their organization. Years later, it would be discovered that both the Nation of Islam and the Muslim Mosque Incorporated had been infiltrated by police and FBI informants. Undercover police officer Gene Roberts would later testify that his first assignment was to infiltrate the Muslims. Malcolm took a United Arab Airlines flight from Frankfurt to Cairo when he spent 2 days sightseeing and thinking. Malcolm was greeted warmly in Cairo, and through the influence of a man he had met on the plane, he joined a group of Muslim pilgrims who, like him, were making the pilgrimage to Mecca. The trip to Mecca, for people first coming into Saudi Arabia, begins in the city of Jeddah. On the plane into the coastal city, there was an Arab expectation as the pilgrims, dressed in the traditional covering of white cloths, one about the waist and one over the shoulder, began the most important journey of their lives. There were thousands upon thousands of pilgrims at Jeddah, of all races and all colors. In a way, Malcolm felt part of the huge mass of humanity. He was the same color or lighter than most of them, but he didn't know the rituals that they knew. And when they chanted Islamic prayers, he didn't know them. Malcolm decided to watch and to learn. He was assigned to a group of pilgrims and guides, and a guide who was to be responsible for them. Malcolm's group approached the officials who inspected the passports and belongings of the pilgrims. His American passport was examined, as was his letter of permission from Dr. Schwabi. It was not sufficient. Despite the pleas of the Muslims who were with his group, Malcolm was told that he had to go before the Muslim High Court, the Mahkama Sharia, for final approval. The Mahkama Sharia for final approval. The pilgrimage to Mecca is a religious pilgrimage. The pilgrimage to Mecca is a religious privilege, not taken lightly by the Islamic world. It is not a journey to be taken by sightseers or those who are not truly Muslims. Your ass won't be touring over there. But it was Friday night, the Islamic Sabbath. Malcolm had to wait until the next day to appeal to the court because it was Friday night. He was taken to a place to rest. There were other Muslims there. At prayer times, he was embarrassed because he did not know either Arabic or the Islamic rituals. He was a Muslim minister in the United States without knowing the fundamentals of his own religion. Malcolm worried that he would be refused the needed permission. Then he remembered that he had the telephone number of Razan Azam's son. Abd, A-B-D, Arrahman, Abd Rahman Azam. He had his son's number because, he gave him all them contacts. Still unsure of himself, he went to a man who looked like an official and asked him to make a telephone call to the author's son. The official complied, and in an amazingly short time, the man, the son of an author of a book on the Islamic religion, had come to get Malcolm. Soon they were on their way to the city of Jeddah, where Malcolm was put up in a luxury hotel, Honey, Malcolm was learning about the world of Islam, but he was learning something else too, that he was well known and respected throughout the world, throughout the whole world, baby. The men who showed Malcolm this hospitality were Muslims, and they were white. They talked to Malcolm about his conversation. They talked to Malcolm about his conversion and about his racial attitudes. There's a saying in the Islamic faith that one cannot be a true Muslim unless he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. And Malcolm was asked if he really felt that all white men were devils. Malcolm explained that in Saudi Arabia, the term white was merely a description of a person's color, while in the United States, it often reflected racist ideas such as the superiority of one race over another. When signs were put on drinking fountains, noting that one was for white people, and the other for colored or Negroes, they were really saying that people of color were not good enough to drink from the same fountains as whites. They let the dog drink from the fountain, but a black child couldn't drink from the fountain. The racial problems in Europe and North America were well known in other parts of the world, especially in those areas in which there were people of color. Saudi Arabia was a country in which people of all colors, many of whom were as dark or as darker than Malcolm. In the morning, Malcolm was taken before the judge and questioned about the sincerity of his beliefs. Malcolm was completely open and answered the questions carefully. At the end of the questioning, he was recognized as a true Muslim. I hope you will become a preacher of Islam in America, he was told. With that, Malcolm's name was entered into the Holy Register at Jeddah. Ooh, maybe we'll see. Maybe we'll see it sometime. Ooh, I claim that. That evening, he was driven to Mecca. Malcolm Little, the son of a Baptist minister, the teenage burglar, formerly the leading voice of the Nation of Islam in America, was about to make the final conversion to Islam. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. And that's in the autobiography of Malcolm X. The pilgrimage to Mecca is not simple. To be lawful, the pilgrim must wear only the traditional covering, must stand in Arafat, 12 miles from Mecca, and circle the sacred black stone in the Kaaba in the court of the Great Mosque. In addition, the pilgrim must spend time in Al-Muzdalifah, run between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and perform other rituals. Malcolm, with the help of his Muslim guide, performed the rituals and made the sacred Hajj that only a small percentage of Muslims are privileged to make. Malcolm spent some time in Saudi Arabia as the guest of King Faisal. He was surprised that his hosts were as eager to talk to him as he was to them. People from all over the world asked him what was going on in America, and why blacks were suffering so. The news from back home told of riots in New York City, Jersey City, and Detroit. What would happen to the great Western country, they asked. Malcolm said that it depended on what Americans learned from the riots. Malcolm flew to Beirut, Cairo, Lagos, and Accra. He was astonished at how many people not only recognized him, but had listened to his speeches. As he traveled, he encountered people of all kinds and all races who had many who had proven themselves as fighters against oppression of any kind. Malcolm spoke at universities, to small groups of government officials, to American expatriates, and to Peace Corps workers. He spoke to whites as well as blacks. With the ambassador from Mali, the daughters and widow of Richard Wright, the Black American writer, and with Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, a state dinner was held in his honor by the Chinese ambassador to Ghana. Part of Malcolm's trust for these people, his growth, was his new willingness to accept people as individuals. He had always accepted blacks as individuals, understanding that some were race conscious and fighters for human rights for all people, while others were busy emulating whites to the detriment of other blacks. But for a long time, he had not accepted whites. Now he knew he must change. Malcolm X in a mosque. See? That's the picture on the cover right there. Woo! Chapter 14, honey. You ain't got long. I'm gonna read this part fast and good, okay? I'm gonna try to. A new message. Malcolm took a new name, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. He returned to the United States on a Pan Am flight from Paris on the 21st of May. He arrived at 4:25 in the afternoon, and his wife met him with their daughters and a few followers. It was hardly the same. It was hardly the same Malcolm whom they had known before. Clearly not the same Malcolm who had helped build a temple in Detroit nearly a dozen years before. When he had been with the Nation of Islam, he had expanded that organization to build a larger base of African American activists that had ever been assembled before. But now that he had left the Nation of Islam and had spoken to African and Asian leaders, now that he had gained the attention of so many people of color around the world, Malcolm had become potentially the most dangerous man in America. His speeches were a call to arms. The newly awakened people from all over the world pose a problem for what is known as Western interests, which are imperialism, colonialism, racism, and all these other negative isms or voyeuristic isms. Just as the external forces pose a grave threat, they can see that the internal forces pose an even greater threat. By this time, the FBI was monitoring his phone calls, his travel arrangements, and his speeches. Paid informants reported on his private conversations. Gene Roberts, a black undercover agent, who would later use his color to infiltrate the Black Panthers for the FBI, attended his meetings. Malcolm had a new message that he needed to get out. 2 days after he arrived at Kennedy Airport, he announced in a debate with journalist Louis Lomax that he had changed his mind about whites. And shortly after in Chicago, he stated that he would be willing to work with white groups if he felt that they were sincere in their efforts to help African Americans gain a full measure of freedom. And it didn't work. White people right back where they started from. Ain't no infiltrating this time, goddamn it. Ain't no motherfucking infiltrating no more. Not if Malcolm were here right now, he would let us know now. You can be civil with them, respect them, be civil with them, live and let live. But you can't be in on this building, this creating. You cannot be in on it. Ask him. Talk to him about it and see what he let you know. But yeah, he changed his mind. Malcolm repeated his theme of creating a worldwide bond of Black people. He created in a letter to the Amsterdam News that Pan-Africanism would accomplish for people of African descent what Zionism had done for Jews all over the world. It would give Blacks from the United States, from Ghana, from Nigeria, Mali, South Africa, Brazil, Cuba, and all the countries where Blacks found themselves a spiritual bond that will be a source of identity and strength, y'all. The formation of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated had been Malcolm's response to his break with the Nation of Islam. Now he wanted an organization that had a more international purpose. And on the 28th of June, 1964, Malcolm announced the formation of the Organization of African American Unity, Afro American Unity, and that's AFRO American Unity. The tenets of the new organization were considered at great length and carefully written. They represented a major shift in Malcolm's thinking. Establishment. The Organization of Afro-American Unity shall include all people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere, as well as our brothers and sisters on the African continent. And just because he was willing to work with them, that don't mean on the most important projects either, that he was willing to work with them. While the teachers of the Nation of Islam indicated that all peoples of African descent were brothers and sisters and participants in the struggle for justice, Malcolm's Pan-Africanist view took the teachings of a major step forward by announcing that the organization was established specifically to unite Africans on an international basis. It is also interesting that Malcolm worded the declaration to include Africans, not just Black Africans. This is the first meeting of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And that brings me to the many times we've been colonized. Because I was listening to Mike TV, and you know, he said that in 1492 we were Indian. That's what we are, Indian. In 1682, we were classified as Negro. Then in 1851, we were classified again as colored. Then in 1960, we were classified again colored, and then in 1960, we were classified again as Black. And then I got 1988, we were classified again as African American. However, I do have 1782, we were classified as African Americans, or maybe one or the other was Afro Americans. It's been so many of them. And I just be trying to write down so I can at least go back and learn, because they're trying to reclassify your Black ass again. Oh, and you can go to Colonial 2020 and donate to Mike TV. That's where we're going to get our genealogical work done about our ancestry, and you know, all of that good stuff. But yeah, go to Colonial. It's Colonial 2020 on Cash App. Mm-hmm. And thank you. Gratitude. Another indication of Malcolm's changing philosophy lies in the preamble to the Charter of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, resolved to reinforce the common bond of purpose between our people by submerging all of our differences and establishing a non-religious and non-sectarian constructive program for human rights. And I read somewhere that's what we needed, human rights instead of civil rights. But you know, I digress. I'm learning. As National Minister of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm had carried out a policy in which the Nation of Islam did not participate with other groups in civil rights activities or protests. Ooh. As National Minister for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm had carried out a policy in which the Nation of Islam did not participate with other groups in civil rights activities or protests. In this new document, he announced that he was willing to put aside differences between his new group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and other Black groups. He began to work feverishly to build up the organization. He would not, however, be working with Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper that Malcolm had established as the voice of the Nation of Islam, began to print articles against him. They accused him of betraying Elijah Muhammad and of never having believed in his message. It was pointed out that to accuse falsely a Muslim of adultery was a sin. It was brought to Malcolm. It was in the papers. The man was going to do a paternity test. Obviously, you did something or you didn't do something to need a paternity test. But they felt betrayed then. Malcolm kept getting death threats. When he appeared on radio call-in shows, anonymous callers would say that he was going to be bumped off and that he was as good as dead. The calls came to his home as well, even when he had his number unlisted. Malcolm told Alex Haley that he had helped form the Nation of Islam and knew what its members could do and what they couldn't do. He indicated that the Muslim organization did not have the ability to do that kind of spying. He suspected that there was a government agency somehow involved in the threats and began to mistrust people in his organization. In July, Malcolm returned to Africa and attended the Organization of African Unity in Cairo. He was the only American allowed to attend the conference and submitted a paper in which he asked the delegates to consider the plight of the 20 million African Americans in the United States. Again, it was noted by American observers that Malcolm had full access to the African delegates, when other Americans, what they asked wasn't even allowed in the meetings. Because your asses wasn't no goddamn good. Your asses was some motherfucking sellouts, and didn't nobody want to trust you to come in. Malcolm, we trust you. You come in. You really love your people. People know where the love is. Malcolm was clearly being welcomed in Africa. Alexandria in the north of Egypt looks more like a European than an African city. The Roman influence is still very much present, and the inhabitants are well educated and cosmopolitan. Malcolm spoke to over 600 Muslim students representing 73 Asian and African nations at a banquet given by the Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs. In Addis Ababa, he spoke to 500 students. Malcolm realized that his best chance to create a really lasting organization would be to get the support of African leaders. Something he thought he could do. Malcolm arranged conferences with Jomo Kenyatta, president of Kenya, and Milton Obote, president of Uganda. Ooh, honey, we made it to chapter 15. Thank you so much, family. I thank you so much. I really do. And Malcolm, thanks you. I know Malcolm is really happy that we reading his book. Every time we read his book, I'm not even going to put my books up. I'm going to keep these books out. Yep. I thank you so much. And tomorrow we'll start on chapter 15, the word on the street. The word on the street, honey. Sure will. And we'll finish it tomorrow. Yep. I thank you so much, everybody. I really do. And I love y'all to life and afterlife. We went over just a few minutes. I ain't even going to keep us with no song or nothing like that. You just know. Keep your gratitude and keep a song in your heart. And process this. Yes, let's process and rejuvenate ourselves with this reading right here. Our good readings, let's rejuvenate ourselves with the love of Malcolm, the way Malcolm loved us. Honey, I don't know. I can't think of nobody that loved us this side of the afterlife like Malcolm X loved us. I'm sure, it's my opinion. We all got them, right? But I love y'all. And let's just go rejuvenate ourselves. And I'll see you on the next page. Peace and power to the people, too.